Would that I could see you all face to face. But nonetheless, I welcome you on this, the 7th day in the month of November, the first Sunday in November, in the year of our Lord 2021. This is the 24th Sunday after Pentecost. And the gospel, which comes to us from Mark, reads in this way. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Mark 12, verses 38 through 44. Temple tossed. I rather enjoy to wear the white robe that is customary for a first Sunday in our church each month. And I like the look of the black one I wear for services on other Sundays. The white one has ballooning sleeves and it drapes nearly to the floor as I move about. I even have to gather its hem in my hand to prevent my stepping on it as I climb the stairs. The black one, too, has wide open sleeves and is richly embroidered. It even has the A.M.E. shield sewn into its stole, a stole that signifies my African ancestry in its mild simulation of the traditional colors of the kente cloth from West Africa. In each instance, the robe is intended to signify my calling as a preacher and as a pastor. And in more cases than I care to admit, these pastors' robes can become exceedingly elaborate in design. So much bombast, pretension, and egoism comes to be expressed in them that the robes speak so gaudily to the wearer's own haughty self-assessment that the austere weight of the calling is lost altogether. Jesus sternly admonishes his disciples to be wary of such ostentation, the self-glorifying parade of the religious elites who preen and sashay hither and yon around the temple's precincts in a show of puffed and perfumed stuffiness, the better to elicit fawning praise and obsequious deference to their oily authority. These folks insist upon their privileges of rank and station and standing within the community and expect that high back chairs with ornately carved wooden arms and plush velvet seating will be pulled out to seat them at important affairs and at august social events. They will harumph at any perceived slight to their bloated sense of self-worth, and they will demand slavish apologies that they may be mollified and appeased. But Jesus sees through their vainglorious conceits to the very heart of their evil intentions. How did they come to possess so much wealth? These professional religion hucksters, these cons with crowns, these grifters for grace, and these pimps for prayers. How is it that the maintenance of the temple has led to the palming of so much cash. Jesus is looking on from a distance and notices the temple system for collecting tributes, tithes, and offerings. A system that over time has become wicked. The scene is so common in its repetition of the practice that has taken hold on everyone in Judea that Jesus cannot help but to underscore the way in which the rich make their way to deposit their offerings in the full light of day. The better to be seen and the better to be heard. The huge funnel would receive whatever anyone wished to contribute to the temple's operation and its works. The coins would roll about and rattle in a tinkling sound of copper on copper. They fell to the chest below within the temple walls with a dramatic flare of apparent generosity. But what is all this largesse intended to secure beyond the necessary upkeep for the temple itself? Why is there a temple at all, if not to seek God's will for God's people? And what is God's will, and who are God's people? God cares for all, but most certainly God cares for the least of those among us. And never in all the history of Israel has there ever been so profound a hurt as that felt by those most vulnerable, most powerless, and most invisible. The poorest of the poor are those who are most easily ignored and overlooked. Israel knows who they are, and the business of the temple is to address their needs and to attenuate their sufferings. The widows, the orphans, and the immigrant strangers within the gates. But Jesus shakes his head with disgust to see how twisted the temple's mission has become, to serve as leaders and officials at the expense of those they should seek and save. Jesus' critique is scathing, direct, and it cuts to the quick. These are his words. They devour widows' houses. Just take a moment now and ponder what Jesus has just exposed. A woman who had lost her husband may have had something left her in her husband's will. He may even have left a house. But if the house had been encumbered, she had to settle accounts before she was free to enjoy the house in the years remaining to her. She would most usually seek counsel from someone who might represent her in any legal proceedings, and so she sought such advice as she believed she might trust. It was customary to seek such counsel from temple officials, but always at cost. If she could not pay what she owed, her property could be seized to make restitution. Temple officials took fees for prayers, and they took fees for legal representation too, just as they did for everything else. What did Jesus say? They devoured widows' houses. So how deeply troubling to Jesus' spirit must it have been to see a poor widow coming with a couple pennies, a few copper coins, to make a solemn and priceless gift of all she had to the very system that exploited her. The temple was supposed to spare her so miserable a fate as complete destitution, but instead it reduced her to lifelessness. In Jesus' keen observation, she had given all she had, while others had given out of their obscene abundance. To say she gave all she had was to acknowledge that she kept nothing back with which she could keep living. The poor woman had nothing left and could only hope that someone might supply the gnawing aching needs she had for food and for water, for shelter and for protection, for warmth and for sisterhood. But the temple utterly failed to supply these needs. Instead, it made the rich richer and the poor poorer. It never even bothered to take her name so as to acknowledge her sacrifice later. But consider now that we too may be aggrieved to see that Jesus does not move to mitigate the severity of that poor widow's condition. On so many other occasions, he has jumped to the task of healing the sick, feeding the hungry, of raising the dead. But in this case, he simply makes an observation from a distance. He does not stop that woman. He does not interact with her in any way. He does not retrieve her offering for her or give her any of the money that is held by Judas in trust for his itinerant band of disciples. After all, Judas is the treasurer. He simply marks her quiet departure. She slips away into obscurity and anonymity, and perhaps, even worse, into the dark shade of death itself. But lest we be too quick to harshly judge Jesus for negligence, it should be remarked that upon the close of this episode, some of Jesus' disciples looked upon the temple, its design, its architecture, and the massive stones that have been used in its construction with gawking awe. They wonder if Jesus is not similarly impressed. But Jesus is not in the least amused by so monumental and imposing a structure. He observes that not one stone will be set upon another, and that in due course the whole building will be raised from the ground. And why not? After all, the reform of the temple's wicked exploitation of the poor and the defenseless will require perhaps its destruction. Start all over. Its reform is inevitable because the temple, at least as it's operating in Jesus' day, is an affront to God. And it was intended and established for the sake of the worship and the veneration of God. It has become instead the home of money changers and merchants of paraphernalia. Get your pear cloth here. Genuine piety has long since vanished. The scribes fashioned themselves princes of fashion, and the priests make a showy mess of praying lengthy and irrelevant prayers. The weight of the building and all its practices has crushed those least able to bear it. The widow dies as countless others before her have died, unnoticed, unheralded, uncelebrated, and unnamed. But this is just the clue we have been seeking. In just a few days' time, I want you to mark that this is late in the gospel now. Jesus himself will be taken into custody by temple authorities. He will give all that he has of his very life. He will not give money, but he will give his blood. He will not offer his billfold, but his flesh instead. And like the poor widow who prefigures the Christ, he will die for the ones who seek to devour his house of bread, his house of light, and his house of living waters. Jesus' trial will be unjust. The sentence will be unjust. And the execution too will be an unholy travesty of justice. This injustice in the treatment of Jesus puts him squarely on the side of the oppressed, on the side of orphans, on the side of alien strangers, and on the side of poor widows. In the end, Jesus is not on trial, but the temple undergoes a condemnation of its earthly extravagance, its ruthless manipulation of public trust, and its idolatrous celebration of material prosperity. Jesus is in the long line of the ancient and esteemed prophets of Israel. He came to summon Israel once again into holy covenant with God, to seek the renewal of the less fortunate, and to encourage the hopeless never to faint or tire. He came that the creation itself would cease from groaning and be redeemed. He came to save the fallen and to rescue the lost, to gladden the hearts of the widows and to parent the orphans. He came to put the temple on the solid foundation from which it could never again be shaken. Jesus builds the temple in the spirit of holiness, which no human hand could ever craft or mold. It receives no tribute in coin, but only in good deeds, in the joyful work of the saints who comfort the comfortless and speak for the voiceless. I see the trudge of the widow after she gave her mite, and I see Jesus taken from the cross after he had given his life. I see the glory of God lighting up the dark, dank world, and suddenly I see my robes, not for show, but for service, where the embers of my faith are wont to glow. Are you hungry? I will give you the bread of life. Are you thirsty? There is a fount I know that will yield for us waters springing up unto eternal life. Are you cold? Take my robe and be made warm once more. Are you lonely? I know a people all about my church, the temple of love, made of sisterhood and brotherhood. It will lift your spirit and then will mount in you the urge to witness and to say at last, oh man,